Stick this here and talk a little better. All right.
So if we can all take our seats, we'll get started again. It's 1 o'clock. Welcome back to everyone. Our first speaker is Bill Fleener from UC Davis.
And we begin. Okay. What we're going to talk about here is Appendix C of comparing futures, delta hydrodynamics and water salinity under future conditions. And while these four authors are probably names or maybe familiar, I'd like to point out we had research support from Dane and Kevin.
And my middle initial is F.
F? Well, Mount would like his middle initial corrected to F. He didn't say anything the last time he saw this presentation. Well, in beginning our discussions of putting together this piece of work, we initially recognized that there are, as we've spoken earlier, 4 different ways to export water through the delta. Through delta pumping, which is what we've currently been doing for many years, some type of peripheral canal or isolated facility. You could operate those in combination, which even if you did a peripheral canal, you'd probably do for a number of years, and ending exports altogether. So our goal in that regard was to quantify these alternatives and understand water quality, which in this rough term means salinity. We've not looked at this time at anything beyond salinity for a water quality objective. And we wanted to understand the consequences of these changes: sea level rise, levee failures, operation alternatives maybe. The one thing we haven't done to date was look at too many changes in inflow due to climate issues. That just seemed to be a little too complicated for the time frame we were working under. So we wanted to understand how these water quality affects the ecosystem and the economics for the state of California. So in order to react as quickly as we did, we used available modeling tools. There certainly wasn't time in a few months to create a new model, calibrate it, get it up and running. We were going to mine existing data, whether that was model output or physical field data collection. And obviously we're going to avoid system reoperation, whether it was modifying the way we released water from dams or modifying climate. We didn't look at either. So the primary model we used was a tidally average model, which is called WAM, the Water Analysis Module. It was developed primarily by RMA and part of it by MBK for the DREAMS, the Delta Risk Management Study. I don't know how extensively they used it, but basically let me describe what this model is. It's a one-dimensional tidally average model. So the tide is a fixed value. Now, one of the problems that creates is how are you going to account for dispersion? Well, that was the unique thing that this model incorporated. One of the other things that's going to increase dispersion is raising sea level. It's going to increase baroclinic circulation and increase dispersion as well. So a 3D model was implemented by Mike McWilliams and Ed Gross and looked at the increases in horizontal dispersion due to sea level rise. These dispersion coefficients were then reduced and placed into the 1D model to accurately simulate the increased dispersion due to sea level rise. One of the other advantages of this model over possibly the use of some others is it does have a downstream boundary condition in the middle of the North Bay as opposed to Martinez, which is obviously part of the question. To simplify it, to make it run quickly, it does aggregate a few channels. These would be parallel channels where you can just aggregate, put the same flow together. So as long as you're not looking for some result in the middle of those channels, but an overall picture, it will still hold true. And we were looking at the big picture and didn't feel that was an issue. Some of the minor channel exchanges are regressions in order to keep from having to spend a great deal of time calibrating the model, and in order to simplify it from the time it takes to actually compute. Some of these very minor channels were done with regressions to exchange water based on stage and other flow conditions. Possibly another issue that might affect a value if you looked at a very local value would be the fact that it aggregates delta internal consumption use intakes and exports into the delta from, I think DSM-2 uses 142 or 146 locations. It aggregates those into 5 and places them into certain locations. So that could possibly cause a short-term issue at any given point if you looked at a very short local issue, but we were looking for long-term and it should not affect things significantly. And I already mentioned the improved dispersion, which was critical in examining sea level rise. So one of the things we did is we wanted to look at a longer-term issue, so we chose 1981 through 2000. I don't believe from my memory of the conversations that it was any great elaborate discussion about it, except it did include one of the wettest periods and one of the driest periods. And it turns out it has 7 critical years and 8 wet years. We maintain operations for that period, 1981 through 2000. That includes inflows, gates, barriers, all export levels. They were all maintained at the same level, except when we looked at no exports. And for an ecological constraint, we looked at maintaining a minimum of 10,000 CFS in the Sacramento River whenever we chose to simulate a peripheral canal. This is somewhat arbitrary, although has some logic behind it. There's been work by John Bureau at the USGS to identify the fact that somewhere between 9 and 10,000 CFS, you start getting reverse tidal flows at locations where the intake would be possible. And we wanted to avoid that so that we weren't taking maybe desired species. And except in no exports and unimpaired flow, the outflow remains the same. So one of the things that's worth looking and seeing is what has happened to water exports since 1955, 1956. And it's easy to see that they've steadily grown. And the red horizontal lines basically represent 5-year averages. And one can see that these 5-year averages have steadily increased, although they've somewhat leveled off recently. And this is the 20 years we examined. For that 20 years, the export values out of CVP and SWP for that period were just under 5 million acre feet. And you can see in the 7 years since, we're probably closer to 6. Individually, if you look at the flows, this is what Freeport would look like with unimpaired flows, no exports upstream. With the conditions we now operate, which is our base case, everything operated the way it was, these are the flows you now see going past Freeport, about 25 to 30% less during the peak flow, and actually more during the lower flow periods. 4 months low flow, we actually have more. These values would be reduced under a peripheral canal scenario by however much was taken out. At Stockton is a little bit different story. We see that, of course, there never was as much flow from the San Joaquin River, but we're in the base case we have actually taken out about 80% of the water that flows up from the San Joaquin River. And you can see that only minimally do we ever actually leave more in than used to come. So these are some of the locations I'm going to be discussing here as far as water quality is concerned. Chips Island, Edmonton, Jersey Point, Contra Costa Water District intake, and down around Banks. Now, there's no question that sea level has risen, and the whole character of the delta is based on sea level. It was able to keep up with sea level with accretion as sea level rose, and was an intertidal marshland for most of its history until we intervened with the dikes and made islands. All the hydrodynamics, habitat conditions, levee heights, everything we deal with are tied to sea level. So as it rises, we become a victim of that sea level rise. Most all of us agree that sea level rise is increasing, and of course we've measured it in the top graph since the early 1900s. We know how fast it's been going up. Most predictions say that that's going to go faster in the future, and any modest rise is obviously going to overwhelm the delta levee network as it now stands. So what I want to show here is a very cute little animation, and let me explain it. On the left-hand side is the base condition. It was run for 20 years, although I'm only going to show a small piece of it. And on the right-hand side is the same simulation, same operational conditions with 3 foot of sea level rise. If I can find a mouse. Here's a mouse. Okay. And we can see, I mean, quite clearly that there is more salinity intrusion as sea level rises. 1992, this simulation was started. You probably can't read that in the bottom screen. But 1992 was a fairly dry year. We get fairly significant intrusion because of that dry year, even without sea level rise. And it will shortly go into one of the wettest periods, one of the wetter periods, 1993, at which point you'll see that under this wet condition, both will look pretty much the same as the delta is flushed out. And that's coming any second now, I assure you. So it flushes out to about pretty similar conditions. And then what is also interesting is with 3 foot of sea level rise, that intrusion will, even in spite of that great flush, will come back quite quickly. So we're into April, May. So it starts drying out here pretty soon. June. You will notice that the lower level of this is 500. So you can see that we have 500 plus coming out of the San Joaquin River most of the time now. And you can see that even after that wet winter, we still have, with 3 foot of sea level rise, significant intrusion. Now, I guess there are a lot of ways to look at this. One could come here and look at time series data at any given point, and that would bore all but the real hydrodynamic nerds. And we chose this method, the water wheel. It goes from October, November, all the way around the end of the year. Looking here at these points, Chips Island, Edmonton, Jersey Point, Contra Costa, and Banks. Now, the shaded portion of each of these represents the period during which there are regulatory issues. And these are basically the EC values of those regulatory limits. Okay? So the base case, which we ran for 20 years, looks like this. Now, one thing I want to point out is this says, okay, we're out of compliance, what is that, 25% of the time at that point, which was March. That's not necessarily accurate, because this just represents the days per month over that 20 years period that we were out of compliance. And actual compliance is usually a 14-day running average or some such relationship. So it's not a message that we want to give that we're already out of compliance, because we haven't really examined that. The message this will give is how does it vary from year to year? And that is what models do best. All models are wrong. Some are useful. We think this one is useful. And its greatest use is to compare different inputs and to getting their simulated outputs. So 1 foot of sea level rise, we can see that not much happens at Chips, but Edmonton, we start getting more salinity in Jersey Point, and it affects the southern delta much more significantly because we're pulling that water down through the pumps. 3 foot of sea level rise, Chips goes up a little, Edmonton, Jersey Point go up quite a bit, and Contra Costa and Banks are going to be very expensive to treat. One of the things that doesn't look at, because that looked at 20 years averaged, so we split out the critical and the wet years at Jersey Point and Edmonton. And in the wet years, the agricultural limit at Jersey Point is 2,200 and at Edmonton 2,780. And during critical years. And during wet years, it's 450 at each location. So these represent different criteria of compliance, this being much more stringent than this. And you can already see that 1 foot and 3 foot of sea level rise is going to add to the variability, interannual variability at these locations quite extensively, which could likely be a good thing. So that was sea level rise. So now we have to consider island failures. Well, we found, although the WHAM model was actually set up to simulate island failures, we found that examining calibration files that it just wasn't ready for prime time yet. So we did not use it. The island exchange and dispersion of these failed islands simply wasn't close enough to be considered useful. So our option was to use another model. 20 years with some other model, 2D or 3D, was obviously going to be too computationally intensive. But fortunately, RMA2 had been applied by RMA as part of the DREAM study to, I guess, 3 or 4 different sets of scenarios of flooded islands. And those are what we used for examination. In this animation, the left-hand panel represents, if I can find the pointer here, the left-hand panel represents intact islands, so it's the base case as we saw it. The right-hand side represents 5 western islands. You can see these are already flooded. Sherman is included in those 5 islands and will flood during this animation. So what we can see here is, well, you can almost even intimate from the starting point that those 5 flooded islands increase salt dispersion into the delta, salt transport through the delta. And this is a period of 2003 that I just grabbed for so long ago I'd have to go back and look at my rationalization for the year, but only 2002 through 2004 was actually simulated for these bases. For the DREAMS report, they looked at 5 western islands, 5 eastern islands, 5 southern islands, and all the islands failed. And you can see clearly that when 5 western islands fail, that we get increased transport of salt into the delta and particularly down towards the pumps. Now, one thing this study doesn't say is what happens if there's 4 of those islands, 3 of those islands, 2 of those islands. It only looked at the 5, so there's still a lot of work to be done to determine what is the total meaning of that. Also, nothing was done to say, what if we keep parts of that island levee intact and only fail it in certain locations, what would happen? It could be that the islands could be let go or flooded and still not create an impact in the middle of the delta. So, operational changes we looked at were variations of a peripheral canal. We looked at 2,000 CFS PC. We looked at 7,500. We looked at 15,000. Now, we stayed with those operational criteria. And, of course, the base case is still the same as we saw before. Those operational criteria were, we still exported exactly the same amount of water, but if we took 1,000 CFS, or in this case, 2,000 first case I did was no exports. And you can see how much fresher the delta gets in the north, but we get extra salinity in the south because we're not pulling fresh water down, so we get a greater influence from the San Joaquin River in the south end of the delta. But I want to reiterate that we maintained that 10,000 CFS. So if there were exports and the Sacramento River was below 10,000, we still pumped it through the delta. We did not decrease the total exports. But if there was 15,000 CFS in the delta, we only needed 4,000. We turned the pumps off, moved the 4,000 via the canal. So none of these simulations were we ever able to move all the water through a peripheral canal due to that 10,000 CFS limitation. So with a 2,000 CFS PC, we can see at Chips Island that salinity increases. Although this is all relative and not necessarily the same increase we saw with sea level rise proportionally. It does increase, and some people say, well, how would that happen? You still have the same net delta outflow, and we do still have the same net delta outflow, but we're not directing the outflow in the same manner. We have different proportions between the Sacramento River and the San Joaquin River than we did have, and that lets Chips get more saline. Edmonton, and that shows up between Edmonton and Jersey Point, where Edmonton gets higher salt, Jersey Point gets less. And the reason it gets less is because we're pulling less down from the bay by the pumps, because we're not pumping 2,000 CFS at times. Contra Costa and Banks both improve. One thing this doesn't show is obviously the water being exported would improve quite a bit, because we're now taking the bulk of it from a fresh Sacramento as opposed to a higher saline South Bay, the South Delta. Then we have a 7,500 CFS canal, and again we see the basic same trend, although the lower delta, the southern delta, doesn't seem to change quite as much. And I don't believe I did 15,000, and the biggest reason I didn't is because it kind of lays on top of 7,500, because due to our operating constraint of 10,000 CFS in the Sacramento River, you're taking very little additional water, so it's basically the same output. So one of the other things interesting, I don't even think we got into this in the report because we actually hadn't examined it, but what does that mean to old river flows? Well, in the base, Old River and Middle River obviously are the ones of interest, so as a surrogate I just graphed Old River. You can see here that in Old River, and it's probably no surprise to us, that on an average, monthly average, we're always pulling Old River backwards. If we had no exports, it would always be going positive. That's probably not a big mystery to anybody either. But what is of interest is what would a PC do to that? And 2,000 CFS reduces that negative flow considerably, and 7,500 CFS, which in the case of our experiment was about the optimum size, strictly due to our 10,000 CFS limit, probably reduces Old River negative outflow to within recent Wanger limits and gives us a positive outflow of 5 months of the year. So that's quite a change. Obviously, if we could find a way to manipulate and get all the exports out of a peripheral canal, that would even improve more. So what does that mean? Well, I mentioned earlier that we are exporting a lot of salt, and a peripheral canal would reduce that. Well, currently, through those 20 years, we exported on a daily basis 5.4 thousand tons of salt per day. Seems like a staggering amount. With a 2,000 PC, it would be 4.4 thousand tons per day. With a 7.5 thousand CFS PC, it could be reduced to 3.7. And if you could take it off in the Sacramento River, if you found a way to do that, you'd be down to 2.1. So what happens with sea level rise? We really weren't able to look at island failures due to the short-term duration of the simulations. But with 1 foot of sea level rise, through delta exports is going to increase to almost 7,000 tons per day, while a PC increases marginally, and of course a full PC would not increase at all. This is assuming Sacramento River from upstream doesn't change, because salt does not intrude that far, even with sea level rise. And with 3 foot, you're almost 11,000 tons. 7.5, 6.2, still the same 2.1. The story of these data, as you will hear later on, is somewhere in here. Even our current 6,000 tons per day is going to fallow a lot of the Central Valley ag lands at some point. But somewhere in here, there's a point where that land will likely become sustainable. Yeah.
On your full PC, did you look at the sea level rise simulations? I guess I'm kind of surprised to see that 3 feet of sea level rise, you didn't see any tidal influence of it.
Yeah. Yes. The question was, since you couldn't hear it, the question was at full PC, did we look to see if there was any salt intrusion that far up on the Sacramento River? And the answer is yes, I did look at that. There was no additional salt that made it that far. Okay. So, with that, I'll get to some questions, but I think I made these points. Edmonton and Jersey Point salinities increase with sea level rise. Pump salinities increase substantially with sea level rise. And Edmonton and Jersey Point interannual variability increases substantially as sea level increases. The flooded island story is simple. Some combination of western islands seem to protect delta pump salinity as long as they were failed. There's kind of a caveat, as long as they were failed with at opportune times, in other words, that they couldn't take some big gulp of salt into the delta that wouldn't have to be dispersed. So this is a long-term study, not a short-term issue. Other delta islands, whether it be east-north or east-south, have very little influence on the salinity if they too are pre-failed during ideal conditions. And then operations, Edmonton salinity increases with upstream exports and Jersey Point decreases. And pump salinities change little with upstream PC exports, although obviously the salinity that we're pumping south decreases considerably. And if there are any questions, I would be happy to see if we answered Lauren's earlier question.
About the 5 islands.
Yeah, about the 5. She'd asked earlier about the 5 islands, and the answer is we don't know how many of the 5 islands, but obviously the 5 islands do a significant job at keeping the salinity out if we failed the other islands under an ideal circumstance. Now, if they failed, I mean, even Jones Tract failure as far south as it was in the delta, we saw some salinity sucked down, but it dispersed quite quickly. Of course, it was a time of fairly low flow, and it was a time of fairly high tide. So, you know, you can kind of argue that both ways as to what other failures would do. But as long as we avoid a big gulp, then the long-term salinity situation is fine. In fact, there were modeling studies done after Jones Tract that showed that a long-term failure, it could have been failed, and salinities wouldn't be hurt. But of course, as Robin pointed out, that's one of those islands with infrastructure of great value.
We all have questions. We have half an hour.
I have a quick question. Has the amount of sea level rise so far shown up in is some part of the delta salinity attributable to sea level rise so far? I mean, is there any way we can tell that?
That's a good question. I don't know if anybody's actually ever examined that. I mean, I don't know how records don't go back all that far, and the problem with that is we've changed operations so much over that whole period. I don't know how easily that would be to tease out. We have had, Jamie might know. Come up and talk to a microphone, Jamie.
Jamie, come on up, please.
Sit down there next to Paul for a while.
I'm Jamie Anderson from the Department of Water Resources. As far as I know, we haven't, tried to tease that out from, looking over the last 100 years or so. The salinity records, I don't think, are long enough, and I mean, we have some old kind of spotty data.
Okay.
But like I said, since the operations have changed so much, I think that would be kind of hard to tease out because, I mean, it's such a different delta today than it was.
Continual operational changes, you saw how much exports had changed over that whole period of time. In that whole period of time, there were even a couple of dams that were, if not new, were certainly had their dam heights increased. There'd be so many things to take out of that equation. I'm not sure how you would go about it. plus the fact that any of us that have done field work know how hard it is to get good data today, and it couldn't have been as easy historically. So I don't know how much you would trust it either, because salinity measurements are always questionable, because you don't know, number one, was it surface, was it bottom, was it integrated, what time of day was it done, because historical data usually comes from one record per day, and what's the meaning of that? So I don't think you'd ever get it out. I guess you could play with it with a model and see what it means, but I don't think you could tease out the data.
It might be an interesting thing to look at in modeling land.
Yeah, as a modeling exercise, that would be a lot of fun, yeah.
Bill, it's been more of an indirect effect of sea level rise, but I know with DSM-2, they've looked at simulating a long-term period of record, the kind of the 80 plus years of hydrology, and when they use the historical level of tides, they found some conditions that just didn't make sense, and what they found out, they needed to go back and normalize the tides to today's conditions. So it wasn't I guess the direct effect hasn't been explored like you suggested, but an indirect effect, they did see that if you that the changing tides over just an 80-year period has had an effect on hydrology, hydrodynamics in the delta.
There are many questions along those lines that we still need to examine. We know sea level has risen, okay, and we have some feeling of what's happened to amplitude at the same time, because when we're talking about sea level rise, we're only talking about a mean value. And in some places on the planet, those amplitudes have increased, in some places those amplitudes have decreased. What we haven't really fully examined yet at this time is in future scenarios with increases, what's going to happen to the amplitudes at the Golden Gate Bridge. Those amplitudes can be as important as the mean tide. In addition, what we haven't done at this point, well, this is excellent work done by Mike McWilliams and Ed Gross on this 3D model to get these dispersion coefficients. What we haven't done at this time is in doing those simulations is allow the bay to spread, allow the delta to spread. Those are going to have dampening effects and phase changes on some of the sea level rise. That's a big mystery right now, that and the amplitude changes. And to get all that, we need a little better models. We need more attention to detail on the channel bathymetry. We need a datum that's flat right now. Right now, DSM-2, all the other previous models were originally built with the NGVD 29. It's not a flat datum, and it could be easily found to go out and have a foot or 2 foot difference in channel elevations in some of these reaches. So we need to go back and get the datum straightened out, the additional bathymetry from flooding straightened out, the additional bathymetry of in-channel bathymetry. I don't think any of our models right now account or include some of these in-channel islands, for instance. We need that. Right now we've corrected for that by modifying the roughness coefficient, and while that's a good way to calibrate a model as long as you're running it in a small range, when you're talking about large-scale changes such as sea level rise or operational changes where flow patterns are changing beyond the range of your calibration, then you don't know what your model is really telling you, other than the fact that the direction's probably right, but you don't have nearly as much confidence in the magnitude. Lauren.
So with the PC, you'd get less salt exported. So where's that salt going? It looks like you've got just some increase at Edmonton, but other than that, you don't?
Well, there was always some increase in the southern delta. If you don't pull the fresh water down through the delta, the southern delta gets more saline for no other reason than due to the San Joaquin River. You could see on the animations that the San Joaquin was running above 500 microsiemens per centimeter almost the whole year, and since that range was 500 to 1500, we know it didn't get to 15, but if you look at the historical record, it certainly gets over 1,000 at times. And so that's where the salt is coming from, and a little bit of it goes up the Sacramento, a little further up the Sacramento River, as you saw from the Edmonton values.
Well, Bill, you showed Chips Island getting saltier, so
What?
More salt is getting flushed out.
Yeah.
Right.
No, that would be salt coming in from the bay.
Well, I thought that wasn't the sea level rise scenario.
Even the sea level rise scenario shows Chips Island getting a little higher in saline.
Didn't one of your graphs without a sea level rise show didn't you have a peripheral canal scenario?
Oh, without sea level rise, yeah, you can.
Didn't you see Chips Island getting saltier?
Yeah.
So you're flushing more water, you're flushing more salt out to the bay if you're not exporting.
No, you're pulling it in.
Now you were assuming the same net delta outflow, right?
Yeah, but see, the same net delta outflow. So you might think that it would hold salinities constant, but what happens is you have less coming down the Sacramento River, so some of that salt intrudes up towards the Sacramento River side, and you're changing the balance. So the San Joaquin has a little more flow in it, so it stays a little fresher, Jersey Point, and so you're just kind of adjusting it, and meanwhile in that adjustment, Chips gets a little higher salt content.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, Chips is getting higher salt. That's where some of the salt is going.
Right.
That was the question.
Yeah, yeah. Any other questions?
Do you want to talk some about where you want to go?
I have a question relative to the degree of present-day modification of the river flows, both the San Joaquin and the Sacramento. And I'm wearing my hat as a stream and river ecologist. One of the tools that's been used quite regularly is the Index of Hydrologic Alteration that Brian Richter and the Nature Conservancy has developed as an assessment tool. Has that been run on the Sacramento or the San Joaquin?
Not that I know of. Can Jeff, Jay?
This is a really good question. It's what we'd like to do. No, the answer is, to my knowledge, the answer is no.
Yeah, to our knowledge, the answer is no.
But it's been done on specific tributaries. I mean, they've done IHAs on most of the major tributaries. So Index of Hydrologic Alteration, this is one of the many measurements you can make as to the sort of the magnitude and the character of alteration from the unimpaired flow.
Jeff, I can't hear you, so I doubt that anybody else is hearing you.
Is this working? It is
Yeah.
working. Okay, so the Index of Hydrologic Alteration is a method that Brian Richter and a variety of others from the Nature Conservancy put together to look at the various aspects of flow duration, timing, magnitude, frequency, on all these duration things, on all these characteristics and how much they've changed. To my knowledge, we haven't done that on inflows to the delta, but this certainly has been done for almost every tributary to the Sacramento and San Joaquin system in some form.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's been aggregated. I may be wrong on that, but I don't recall anyone ever aggregating it into a full IHA. And the IHA actually works best on rivers. Doesn't work so hot on estuaries.
Estuaries.
Yeah.
Well, the reason I ask that is that one of the things that's very striking, and clearly your data shows it very nicely, and that is the flow enhancement during 5 or 6 months of the year on the Sacramento, and the flow depletions during 5 or 6 years. It's rather uniform. You're using monthly averages that you're showing there, but you're basically cutting off most of the peak flows and you're supplementing the base flows. And those often have some very severe biological effects in river systems. It's been shown, that you really do change the mix of competitors. You open up non-native species invasions and things like that. And I was just curious to what extent that type of tool has been used in this system.
Yeah, perhaps just looking at the standard deviations of those months might be an interesting thing to add to the data.
I want to follow up with this with Cliff in particular, because if BDCP is looking at flow prescriptions of some kind, are they in fact using an IHA kind of approach to this worrying about flow prescriptions? That is, the concept, for those of you who don't know about this stuff, this is all based on Leroy Poff and others in the natural flow regime paradigm. Don't trust anything with paradigm in the title, but it's which is now about a decade old. But when the concept being that in the absence of definitive information about the biological responses to flow changes, your first step is to look at how much the natural flow regime has changed, and that's as a starting point. And I don't know how much BDCP is using that kind of approach. Maybe others are going to, Loring may be able to address that. But again, so the point is, I think the answer is no. The short answer to the question is we're not really doing that. But that would be something very interesting to do, by the way.
Yeah.
And not that hard.
And the Sacramento River figures I showed you probably would look worse, except under the base case. I mean, we're also diverting Trinity River water down the Sacramento River, whereas an unimpaired, that wouldn't be there.
Well, the critical thing to use that well is to have a period of record when you didn't have a high degree of flow modification.
Yeah.
At the gauge station you used for doing your
Unfortunately, we don't have data to go back that far.
Therein lies the problem.
No such record.
So, Bill, what sort of time step do you think we can get to an unimpaired flow? Because that's what's kind of critical. Can we do daily unimpaired flow?
Well, we used this model to look at daily values of unimpaired flow, the tidally average model. Now, the problem that presented, I don't show any, I rarely show any of those data because of the lack of confidence in the model at that point. I tried to point out early on that some of these channels are regressions, and an unimpaired flow would be beyond any of our knowledge of regression of those exchanges. So I don't believe that internally the values would be accurate. And the only thing I've really used it for is to look at the boundary conditions and net outflow, because that's just a mass balance, so I know that's right. But I hesitate to look at anything internally with that. We would have to work with the model to get some confidence in that regard. The thing to do would be to actually run the full 2D model and then recalibrate the 1D model and then run the long-term thing. That would take somebody with the time and the talent, probably 4 to 6 months. Not a long time.
The other aspect of the sort of daily flows is this is a fairly gentle system except for the winter. In the summertime, fall, much of the spring, it's not real flashy. Down this far down in the system in particular. It would be the winter flows that you'd be interested in the daily. You'll see any daily or weekly variability.
I think Jay had asked what we plan to do.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can maybe talk also, maybe Dane can talk a little bit about, if he wants, on the testing and documentation we're doing on this tidally average model. Make it more generally available.
Dane, you want to explain what we're doing?
Always make graduate students work.
Well, I think this is working. Okay. Well, I think kind of the long-term goal is to make this tool available to anyone that's willing to use it and improve it too. So, kind of my part in this is to write this manual for WAM, and we're also doing some kind of testing on to see how accurate it can be for these simulations. But kind of the long-term goal is to make this available for other people to use. And we're trying to just provide as much information we can about it right now so that people can understand how to use it.
Yeah, and beyond that, what we want to do is once we have an operational manual, what we'd really like to do is get a better 3D model, get the expanded topography so we can expand the bay, expand the delta, rerun those simulations to get the additional baroclinic circulation that goes with sea level rise, put that in the 1D model. Maybe look at some of the regressions that are in the 1D model, maybe look at some of the simplifications and see if they're in areas where we would like better data. For instance, the 5 DICU return flows, maybe we need to spread that out a little bit if we want to look at specific locations as to what's happening versus the big picture. And then the model does include operations. We didn't modify operations at all other than including or removing barriers or gates for things like unimpaired flows. But we didn't use that, but we would like to also include that in the manual and look at some operational changes somewhere down the road.
To what extent are your flooded island scenarios dependent on the type of breach, whether it's a single breach versus a complete removal of the levee versus multiple breaches?
Jeff, tell you to ask that question?
No, I didn't.
It is, of course, highly dependent. I mean, if you think about if you think about Sherman Island, I mean, it's going to make a whale of a difference whether you breach it on the Sacramento or the San Joaquin. Makes a big difference whether you breach it on the west end or the east end. Makes a big difference how many places you breach it. In that regard, what we're doing is starting a little modeling exercise that we call for some reason up front we call it a virtual island, but since it actually exists in modeling world, and maybe it's better to call it a generic island. But so we're starting to do these types of processes with this generic island or virtual island. We'll be able to put breaches in different forms and in different locations, and then just simply by changing the boundary conditions, it would be like rotating the island or moving it to a different place in the delta. And we want to see what type of relationships we can come up with that then would allow us to predict in the future if this island failed, where would be the good places, the bad places. We're certainly not going to get to the point where we can say if you break it here, this is going to happen. But we can say if it breaks here versus here, this would be the general difference. And if we can get that far, we'd be a lot better off than we are now. And that's the type of little exercise we're undertaking right now.
About bathymetry needs relative to the channels. Are there bathymetry needs relative to the islands?
Well, when they fail, yes, but I actually think some of that's known. I don't think it's aggregated. There have been a lot of LIDAR studies. I don't know if it was how many different times of the year it was done, because obviously crops interfere with some of that information. But I think if one went out and we'd love to get a program together to we're not capable of doing it, but we think we know who's capable of aggregating all these data and getting the good data points that we need as far as the landforms are concerned, maybe even as far as the perimeter of the bay is concerned. But until we try to aggregate it, we're not even going to really know what's missing. And then that needs a permanent storehouse. And so it can be pushed forward. And so whether it's Jamie at DWR or us at UC Davis or whoever, we all have these data available to us to keep going on. As far as the in-channel stuff, that's also important, as well as the datum. I think I mentioned rarely do we include in-channel islands in some of this bathymetry, and it can get kind of important. There is a problem with long-term studies of this nature when you're changing flow regimes. We know this system moves sediment, and while it doesn't have the sediment it used to have, maybe that's a good thing. If you change flow balances and flow regimes, you're still going to change sediment in the long term, and then that's going to have another effect downstream. So whatever changes we make, we have to make sure that we're at least going to be able to manage the future changes that the system will make to itself. That's a geomorphology thing that Jeff preaches all the time.
Actually, to add to that, I think Dave Scholheimer is telling us that, in fact, the system has recovered to the sense that the amount of sediment that's coming in is about equal to what it was pre-Europeans. First there was the initial very high flux of sediment associated with hydraulic mining sediment, and then progressively damming everything up. But the sediment's about where it was. But, of course, there's about 1/5 the amount of places to put it.
Yeah.
And that they're in. As you know, Cascade, they're working. Yeah. Dave and others are working on that problem of how to deal with the channels. By the way, this is a really stupid question. I should know the answer to this. When you raised sea level 3 feet, what did you do with bathymetry? Was there a response?
No, there is no response.
So it's just a bigger, deeper channel.
Just a bigger, deeper channel, and all this work. That's why I say it. It's a great first effort. I mean, it's the best we could do at this time. And we need to take better 3D models, let it spread out, get the right dispersion coefficients, modify the 1D, and go again. And the thing we're going to find is a little more accurate answer, but the same directions. I mean, the direction is what's important here, not the final answer.
Did you take a look at Suisun Marsh in your modeling?
Suisun Marsh is in the model. We did not really take a look at Suisun Marsh in this work. We were interested in delta and delta exports and how that affects the state's economy. Suisun Marsh is a more important factor when it comes to Bill Bennett and Peter Moyle's ecological interests. And I think I spoke to some people at lunch. There, as well as islands within the delta having an influence on salt transport, Suisun Marsh flooding can do so as well. And there was this one piece of work that was done, I believe, by Chris Enright, that he flooded the north part and then the south part, and they actually give two different answers due to phase changes in the delta. And so these are some things we need to understand better.
Thank you.
Probably there were several times, I think, during the study when we wish we had. There were several times during our study and discussions that we wish we had some results with Suisun Marsh flooded, but we haven't seen any big hydrodynamic results for that study yet.
So I had more of a tangential question, if I may. We've got a few minutes left. And it made a lot of sense about 20 minutes ago, so we'll see if it still works. So you've characterized hydrodynamic flows across the delta several times, Bill, and not you, but lots of hydrodynamicists talk this way. And I find it very useful when I speak to them and have some idea what they're talking about. And I'm wondering, from a public policy standpoint, if this wouldn't be something for us to think a little more about. And that is, you said something to the effect of, well, when you pull water across the delta down toward the pumps. Now, I know there's a lot of hydrodynamics calculations that go into what makes that happen. But as an ecologist, when you talk like that, it makes a lot more sense to me than, oh, there's some baroclinic change in the underlying exchange factor and the roughness coefficient, and so. So I guess what I'm getting at is do you think there's room in this conversation?
We're working on a dictionary.
Well, no, because I think it's entirely accurate to say that you're pulling water toward the pumps, but people don't want to say that. Can we say things like
I said that.
What we do? I mean, because that's what happens, right? And I'm just saying that as an ecologist, when you talk like that and you say what you mean, the waterscape starts to live for me, and I'm wondering if that wouldn't help us when we bring this information to the public.
Well, that's probably good. I think I was just excluded from the classification of people because I think I did, which my mother will be disappointed. Because I said pulling water down through the delta, but no, you're exactly right. I mean, we look at the flows in the Middle River; they're negative. Some of we put in some barriers in the south just to raise stages, so we could get irrigation water in the South Delta. And then we put in head of Old River barrier, to keep the fish going in the right direction and things of this nature. So obviously it does have a great deal of effect. That's one of the things that we discussed quite a bit while we were putting this report together. Obviously, getting rid of the negative flows towards the pumps would be a great benefit to habitat, to the ecology of these little living things that Bill and Peter know all about, and I don't. But it does. I mean, you saw how it dramatically, even with keeping 10,000 CFS down the Sacramento River and still pumping through the Delta on occasion because you simply have to export what we exported and keep that limit on the Sacramento River, it still greatly reduces the negative flows and impacts in those areas. And there's no doubt in my mind that if you take an estuary and change the direction of flow dramatically, that you're going to change the ecology.
If a pump doesn't draw water towards it, then it's not working.
Yeah, and it's not on, yeah.
Bill, I have a question regarding salinity, and in particular I know enough geochemists who are also people, I think, that I think all salinity is not the same. And could you talk a little bit about the salinity from the San Joaquin and its characteristics versus the salinity that's coming up the bay?
Well, that's one thing we didn't distinguish in this report. We didn't distinguish the nature of salinity. You have three different sources here, in a sense. Actually, there are many more than that, I guess. But the Sacramento River salinity is partially a result of ag returns, partially natural. When we pull water down through the delta, there I go, no longer people. When we pull this water down through the delta, we're also sucking some salt down from the bay. And so we also have some sea salt in that equation. The bad part about that is it pulls down bromides, which are very expensive to treat from a drinking water standpoint. And then the third big source is the San Joaquin River, and that's almost exclusively dissolved solids of ag drainage and wastewater treatment. In fact, San Joaquin River is not uncommon for it to have net negative flow in late August, and it would be a lot worse if it weren't for the ag drainage and the wastewater treatment effluent. So those are very different. We did not, I don't believe, Jay can probably answer this, but I don't believe in our drinking water analysis costs that we distinguish between the two sources.
We did a little bit. This is something maybe Wei Shang can answer tomorrow, in the first talk tomorrow. But when we looked at the water quality coming down the San Joaquin, I was surprised how much bromides were in it. And I'm guessing that's recirculation. You know, it's sea salt that was applied some, I don't know what the residence time is likely to be up there, but so some of the salts that are coming down the San Joaquin River are coming up from the delta. That's important, I think, and interesting, because as we look at reducing salinity in being exported to the agricultural areas, how long and how much of an effect will we see on salinity in the San Joaquin River? And there's some discussion among us as to what effect that's likely to be. There's one school of thought that says, well, those guys are managing the San Joaquin River for vernal salinity standards, so if you put less salt coming in, they're going to still manage the same salinity going out. You're not going to have better water quality in the San Joaquin River. They'll just use it to adjust other things that they're doing in the San Joaquin Valley. There's another school of thought that says, well, maybe they'll screw up and they'll actually improve the quality of water in the San Joaquin River because they don't manage for the salt load as perfectly as they might.
And for a period of time, when you put better water on there, you're just going to be leaching out a lot of the salts anyway. So you're not going to see it. You're not going to see some, discrete step change drop for that reason.
How much of it comes out of groundwater? Who knows? Yeah. But I was surprised to see bromides. Paul, you might have a sense on this. You're this kind of a person.
Yeah, I think you hit on it, Jay. The type of water that you see in the San Joaquin River is very reflective of the export water quality. So it is much more of a sodium chloride type of water as opposed to the Sacramento River, which is more a calcium carbonate type water.
Yeah.
I think that makes a lot of sense. The agriculture on the east side of the San Joaquin Valley is primarily fed from the Sierra runoff directly, and that's very, very low salinity, maybe 50 milligrams per liter, something like that, Paul, if that sounds about right. And on the west side is where a lot of the exchange contractors are, people that used to historically had, I think, riparian rights probably off of the San Joaquin River, and they're now replaced with Tracy Pumping Plant, Jones Pumping Plant, whatever they call it now, Central Valley Project water, which will have all the sea salts and things. So that would be recirculated. That would be the major part of the salinity in the agricultural drainage, I think.
Yeah. Jay, you just brought up another point. The last point that hopefully you will be able to explore this issue of if you improve if you have a peripheral canal, you have better export water quality. How will that translate into better water coming down the San Joaquin River? I think that's an important issue to discuss when we discuss what will South Delta water quality look like.
Hasn't somebody already done that already? I'm looking for someone that's already done some of these studies.
Well, the other reason it possibly would even get worse as opposed to improve is because if they had better quality water to apply, they wouldn't be applying as much. Right? Because right now they have to apply quite a bit just to keep it out, leaching it out. So they wouldn't need to apply as much, so you actually might concentrate more and actually reduce the flow.
Yeah, certainly in terms of volume.
Yeah.
But in terms of salt load.
Right.
But you might find a period where they've reduced their leaching applications, but there's still enough salts in the system working their way towards the San Joaquin River. You might find a period where, because you've improved water quality, they're leaching less, and so while that slug of salt moves its way out, you've got a few years where the salinity might be actually worse in the San Joaquin. And the flows might actually be worse.
Yeah, flows could be less, the load could be a little greater.
Yeah.
Or as bad.
We're already seeing, we're already going through a period of lower flows because of what they're doing on the west side for the selenium, things that they're doing for selenium.
Okay. Any last question? That's the way I was saying I'm a little tired of standing here. Thank you.
Oh, time's up. Okay.
I didn't mean to imply
Oh, I know.
Well, let's take about a 5-minute break, and then we'll have the
I looked there, yeah.
fish folks, the fish heads.
Thanks, sir.
You're welcome.